Hello everybody, and welcome back to Lesser Known History. Today I'm going to be doing a video over a topic that I was able to present at a research conference that I was a part of, and this is some of the historical research that I did, and I just thought you all might appreciate this. So without further ado, let's hop into it. So today's topic is neurasthenia, how a disease stopped a movement. So what is neurasthenia? We'll hop into neurasthenia in just 1 second, but beforehand, it is important that we talk about industrial America. So industrial America was very crowded. There were new ideas that were being thrown out there all the time. There was a lot of social movement going on as people moved from rural communities to urban cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. New ideas were being spread, and two important movements really started to gain traction: the temperance movement and the women's suffrage movement. And there was a lot of anxiety in these cities as these new ideas were being spread around and the status quo was being challenged. Enter a man by the name of George Miller Beard. He was born in Connecticut in 1839 to a very religious family, and he was part of the early neurologists. So, mind you, this is back when science was a mixture of verifiable evidence and then quack medicine. For those of you that don't know what quack medicine is, that is just like medicine that doesn't work. A great example would be, a lot of times there were people that would shock you to try and cure you of depression, which, as we all know, that does not work. But that's just an example of what medicine at the time was. So neurology at this point in time was a mixture of those two things. So some of the things that they did in neurology made sense, some of it didn't. So he was a big reformer of medical education. He wanted to make medical education more accessible to everybody. He saw changes in the ways of American life, particularly with people going into the city and working. But they were working long hours, and he would see that they would grow more and more tired. They may be more melancholic, as he would write. And so he thinks that something is affecting people. So he describes a new neurological disease. He ends up dying young, and that will be important later on. But we're going to talk about this new neurological disease. So, the disease that George Miller Beard describes, he dubs neurasthenia. Now, this is not the first time neurasthenia has even been written about. There's actually another neurologist who talks about neurasthenia and publishes it in a paper about 4 months prior, but George Miller Beard gets all the credit for its discovery because it was based off of his ideas about the disease and his observations that most of the later studies were based off of. So, what is neurasthenia? Neurasthenia is the disease of the central nervous system, or CNS. So that would be your nerves in your arms, your legs, your spine. Most importantly, for this study, is your brain, right? Your brain is the center of your nervous system. So he says that the reason people are getting neurasthenia is because of an overload of stress. Right? Everybody's stressed out, so this new disease is forming. And so here are some of the symptoms that he provides. Irritable moods, being deeply melancholic. You could have claustrophobia, agoraphobia, or anthropophobia. Now, you may notice that these last three things are all phobias. They're all separate entities on their own, and that should give you a clue to the fact that neurasthenia is a disease is completely incorrect. Neurasthenia today, you could have, or it's been broken apart into many different parts. So let's say that you would be diagnosed today with depression. Back then, in the mid 1800s, early 1900s, you could be diagnosed with neurasthenia. Here are some other diseases that fall into that category. Anxiety disorder. You could be schizophrenic. You could have autism. All those different things fall under the wide scope of neurasthenia. And the list of symptoms for neurasthenia could literally go on for pages and pages and pages. So, again, neurasthenia is like a junk taxon in science. For those of you that don't know, a junk taxon is when you take a bunch of animals that seem related, put it all together, and then you say they're all related. That's what happens with neurasthenia. So this is Silas Weir Mitchell. So he builds off of George Miller Beard's ideas when George Miller Beard dies. And he decides to create cures based on gender. he creates one called the West Cure. And this is for men. And he said that this is able to cure a man's innate manly urges. So literally what this cure is if you are a man suffering from neurasthenia, Silas Weir Mitchell will write you a prescription, and you will go out to Montana or Wyoming or in the western United States and work on a ranch for a couple of months. And then you'll come back and you'll feel great. And then for women, he says they need a rest cure. So we all know what bed rest is. Well, rest cures are bed rest just totally blown out of proportion. He said he did this because in his mind that women were more delicate, and that's what he says, which of course is not true, but that's just the writings of a man in the 1880s. So what is the rest cure? So you had to be diagnosed by Silas Weir Mitchell and some other neurologist, and you were forced to lay in bed for weeks or months on end with little to no talking and little to no mental exertion. You maybe got to walk around for an hour a day if you were lucky. This was prescribed primarily to middle upper class and upper class women. Why? Well, this is not because neurasthenia primarily impacted these people. Neurasthenia as a disease probably impacted everybody across the United States, for a reason I'll talk about in a little bit. But it was only middle upper class and upper class women who could afford his services. So social reformers were the main people that were being called up. Why? Well, most middle upper class and upper class women were social reformers during the progressive era in the United States. They were the only women that could afford to go out and not have to work and to go and protest and work behind these social movements. So this led to many of them being diagnosed with this disease. We'll talk about why that's important in just one moment, but the person that you're seeing right here, that is Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So Charlotte Perkins Gilman was a very famous feminist and social reformer of the progressive era. She advocated for women's suffrage, and so she was a patient of Mitchell. She is prescribed the rest cure, and over the next couple of months, her life becomes absolutely miserable. So much so that she suffers psychological damage that takes over a decade to recover from. She ends up divorcing her husband at the time, becomes estranged with her daughter for a little bit. Now eventually she remarries, becomes closer with her daughter again, and everything's okay. But she writes this short story called The Yellow Wallpaper, which is today a quintessential and famous short story of Gothic horror. And in this story, a woman is forced to lay in her bed in her bedroom and look at her yellow wallpaper as she's suffering from neurasthenia and she's undergoing a rest cure. But as time goes on, she grows crazier and crazier, and by the end of the story, she's totally destroyed. And so this was meant as a warning to anybody who wanted to take a rest cure. Perkins Gilman even sends this story to Silas Weir Mitchell. Now, he never responds, but that is a cool thing that she does. So let's talk about the impact. The reason I bring up Charlotte Perkins Gilman is because she's the perfect example of a social reformer who was in a great position to help out movements that she believed in, that was diagnosed with the disease, and therefore took her out of that process. Now, we all know that both of these movements ended up succeeding, although temperance lasted for about 10 years, but they both succeeded. So, was neurasthenia able to totally stop the movement? No. But here's what's important. During the middle of the early to middle beginnings of these movements, we're talking 1880s, 1890s, maybe early 1910s, when they're starting to pick up steam, they're slowed down a lot. Because so many of the leadership of these different organizations are being diagnosed with neurasthenia. So why does this happen? Well, we talked about it earlier. It affects upper middle class and upper class women because they are the only people that can afford to be a part of these social movements. But they're also the only people whose husbands are able to hire Silas Weir Mitchell. And many of these husbands didn't like that these women were being involved in social movements. And so now sometimes Silas Weir Mitchell could have been contacted simply because they wanted to figure out why this woman was feeling so bad. But there are some times when Silas Weir Mitchell was contacted by a high-ranking political official to go examine his wife, with the political official in the back of his mind understanding that if she was diagnosed with neurasthenia, she would either be taken out of the picture temporarily, or she would end up moving on after it was done. So this helped to prolong these movements because of all the upper class women who were being knocked out. If a leader was taken out for several months, and then another one was taken out, and another one was taken out, it was very difficult to be able to plan things out. So it also impacted how society views men and women. The modern day American view of the American West also was heavily influenced by this. The West Cure. The most famous person to ever undergo a West Cure was Teddy Roosevelt. And so part of his Rough Rider, manly man persona is because he underwent a West Cure and it was idolized. And here is a picture called a reading of two women who are suffering from neurasthenia. And notice how they're portrayed in a very passive way and how the room is very dampened down. Well, that's because of the perception of women that was put out there by neurasthenia. And this is a perfect example of why medicine and politics should not mix. Now, we have unfortunately lived in a time where medicine has been heavily politicized. Whether or not you prescribe to different belief systems, it is very well known that the COVID-19 pandemic has taken on a very political tone, very sadly. And so this is not the first time this has happened, not even remotely. We've had multiple times where politics and medicine get involved, and this is a perfect example of another time when medicine and politics were intertwined, and it only ended up hurting people. The West Cure never helped somebody, but a West Cure did. So why? Well, it's very simple. If you were given a West Cure, you were sent on a vacation. You left the busy cities and you returned to the rural area where you were able to breathe fresh air and hear the sounds of nature. You were able to be rejuvenated. Whereas in a rest cure, you're forced to lay down. For many people, this in a room that they hate. And so as this time goes on and your scenery never changes and you're stuck in this rut and it's this circular motion, it really starts to hit you hard. We've all experienced this during the beginnings of the pandemic when we were all forced to sit inside many times in the same apartment or home and not see anybody except for these computer screens in front of us. We suffered an example of a rest cure and we didn't even realize it yet. I hope you guys all enjoyed this different type of video. Again, this was inspired by the lecture that I gave at a research conference. This is the research I did, and I was able to present it. So I hope you guys all enjoyed, and if you guys would like more videos like this of research that I'm able to conduct on my own, please let me know. I'm more than happy to do this. And I hope this was a really interesting rabbit hole to go down. There's so many of these in history, and I really want to cover more things like this. So if you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe, and I will see you all in the next episode of Lesser Known History. Have a great day.